Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 28 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. It's for Friday again, and we're starting just 30 minutes late because I had a camera blow up. I think I'm infamous for my setup, like probably got the most expensive studio that goes wrong all the time, but we're now on the backup good old webcam. So the picture looks a little bit better, but it's also going to be auto-focusing on me. Anyway, the show must go on because things are happening in ultra fast time. If you watch Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 27, you'll be fully prepared because you knew that the escalation with Iran was about to happen, and you were prepared for a reaction in the oil markets, gold markets, and Bitcoin markets. And for some reason, the traditional media wants you to think that it was a surprise, even though it was completely announced and we were preparing people for this in weeks in advance because it was following international law, despite the fact that the media doesn't want you to think that. So in this episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 28, we're going to be doing in part one, the usual Bitcoin news for this week, the macro news for this week, and the geopolitical news this week that is going to be relevant for you building your investment portfolio. If you are new to the show, my name is Simon Dixon, and I spent the last 2 decades obsessing over the subject of Bitcoin investing and money so that you could be more prepared. So let's just jump straight in with Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 88. And today, the main topic is going to be the implications of the Iran, Israel, and Russia part.
Simon, it's episode 28.
28. What did I say, Azad?
Episode 88, by the way.
88. I'm losing my mind. Thanks, Azad. I think we're going to try and do these more interactive in the future. I think it's good when I've got you here as backup because every time I say something silly, Azad helps me correct it. So I think we're probably going to do that from now on. So 28. Right. So what happened this week in Bitcoin? So firstly, this is the week of the infamous Bitcoin halving. In fact, it happens in a few hours from now. And spoiler alert, it's a complete non-event, but it is a massive event if you are a long-term fundamental investor. If you're a trader, then get ready for a big disappointment. Usually, this is a buy the rumor, sell the news event. However, because of some changes in how people are using Bitcoin that I'll cover shortly, it is actually a big event for those involved in those creating NFTs and all sorts of stuff on top of Bitcoin. But what happens in the Bitcoin halving? Well, every 4 years it happens. We've covered it, proof of work. We've explained it in multiple episodes. If you're new, the block reward, a reward is given to miners for performing the role of decentralized central bank and decentralized bank, verifying all the transactions. Their reward that they would receive ordinarily every 10 minutes goes from 6.25 Bitcoin block reward to 3.125 Bitcoin. And that is every block, and a block happens every approximate 10 minutes. That decreases the annual inflation rate, which has a fixed supply of 21 million. Once all 21 million blocks are mined, there is no more Bitcoin to be created. And the only way to get them is to buy them off someone else and persuade them to be willing to sell them. So Wall Street's loading up. All the individuals are loading up. All the companies are loading up. Governments are loading up. And eventually central banks are loading up. Have you loaded up? Because it goes from an annual inflation rate of 1.7% to 0.85% in a few hours. This is now more than half better than the annual inflation rate of gold, which historically has been approximately 2%. But it normally increases the incentive to mine for more gold the higher the price of gold. So Bitcoin is reaching its programmed inflation rate, whereas gold tends to adjust according to the price. And so we'll start to see, but now it is significantly lower than gold. And that was by design because Bitcoin was designed to programmatically mimic the properties of gold, but do the things that gold doesn't do so well a lot better, which has created this interesting time where the whole world is trying to accumulate those 21 million Bitcoin. But this doesn't even factor in the ones that get lost. Unfortunately, Bitcoin is brutal. As more people die, they don't put together an inheritance plan. If you're one of our investors at Bank to the Future, we make sure everyone's got an inheritance plan so they can make some intergenerational wealth. But many people don't bother. So the key dies with that person and the supply contracts, unfortunately, to the benefit of everybody else and not that family. So please don't be one of those people. But for those that do it, unfortunately, it's brutal and it benefits everybody. So Bitcoin is now also catching up with Ethereum in terms of transaction fees. So for those of you that don't know, because more people use Ethereum, it's not digital hard sound money. It tried to replicate some of the properties of Bitcoin when it moved to a proof of stake network. Bitcoin is a proof of work network. And we've covered many different of how those are different and the implications of that and why Bitcoin is the only decentralized one. Well, because of that, more people were using Ethereum in order to engage in launching NFTs and tokens and DeFi and all sorts of stuff. But a lot of that is now coming over to Bitcoin because there was a new upgrade to the code. And this year, if you haven't been stuck under a rock, you'll know that everyone was talking about these new things that were happening on Bitcoin called ordinals. And all of those people that were building on top of Ethereum and other things are now building on top of Bitcoin. And now transaction fees and the demand for transactions in Bitcoin has caught up with Ethereum. And it's growing in popularity. This is good for miners because miners, they're receiving less Bitcoin as their block reward. But just like clockwork, the invisible hand, remember classical economics and Austrian economics, the invisible hand of innovation finds a way of Bitcoin adjusting to its new paradigm, and miners get higher transaction fees as a result of the innovation. And then developers go out and find ways of reducing those transaction fees. And it is the perfect free market that adjusts to whatever Bitcoin throws at it. But now there is a higher utility on top of Bitcoin, which tends to future-proof those transaction fees for miners beyond the block subsidy. And now the news is that the creator of ordinals that created these new geeky things to build on top of Bitcoin is now creating something completely new that does it better called runes. And so everybody is now looking at building things on top of runes, which is a more optimized way of ensuring that the nodes, which essentially verify all the transactions and pass those on to miners, those nodes are able to do it more efficiently. And at block 840,000, which is the fourth halving, which happens tonight, depending on what time zone you're in, or tomorrow morning if you're in a different time zone. But those that are inscripting these NFTs and all sorts of stuff on runes, they're raising finance in Bitcoin in order to pay an ultra high transaction fee in order to guarantee that the first block mined after Bitcoin halving includes their NFT. And this creates an interesting new dynamic to those using Bitcoin in order to, drive innovation on those that want to reduce transaction fees through various different technology built on top of it. You may have heard of things called layer 2 and all sorts of stuff like that. But Rune essentially improves that. And at the same time, the Bitcoin ETF, those that want to own it through shares, which is not something I personally do, but you may want to diversify how you custody it. You do some of it in self-custody, some of it custodied with Fidelity through an ETF, through the stock market, and some of it is maybe held in your retirement fund, which may create some tax deferral and benefit to you. But ETFs are now, even though there was net outflows as the price corrected on the reaction to the escalation of Iran and Israel that we'll be covering a lot more of today, the ETF now nearly has $60 billion back in those ETFs. And so at the same time, Hong Kong has now launched its official Bitcoin and Ethereum spot ETF. I tried to get hold of the prospectuses. I used to live in Hong Kong. I don't speak Cantonese, but I was trying to get a little bit more information around whether those are in-kind distribution. But my understanding at this stage is it won't capture any China volume, but the billionaires that I know from China, they tend to have accounts in Hong Kong, and so they always find a way. So if they want to get exposure, to circumvent some of the restrictions in China. If they can get an account with their brokerage in Hong Kong, through many of them have dual residency, then that produces some new volume in those different types of markets, because China used to be the biggest market for Bitcoin trading until it had a little bit of a crackdown. At the same time, we saw Binance trying to do a bit of a comeback. So they got approval for their regulatory license in Dubai. And we saw the next wave of escalation with the SEC now coming after Uniswap. They sent them a Wells notice. And for those of you familiar that we've covered content we covered in the past, a Wells notice means you have 30 days to respond to the SEC. The SEC is making allegations that they're creating an unregistered securities exchange. They have 30 days to reply. They'll probably say why they're not a security. And then the SEC will probably pursue their legal action anyway, because that's exactly what they did with Kraken in the case of staking, and Coinbase in the case of their exchange, and Ripple Labs in the case of what they were calling an illegal token security offering as well. So we expect later towards the end of Q2, that will have an impact in the decentralized finance market, but Bitcoin will just carry on because Bitcoin doesn't care. And Bitcoin will just carry on. By the way, if you're getting out of focus because I'm moving around, I'm really trying my best to be a little bit more cardboard-like, but because the webcam tends to autofocus, and now I scratch my nose, it's probably going to mess it up. But do me a favor, if you're enjoying this, hit the like button, and I will continue. Help the YouTube algorithms. Do me that favor. And so I'd expect to see Uniswap. I reckon that the SEC is probably going to come after their governance structure. Because remember, Uniswap claims to be decentralized, which in one sense it is. You can connect your self-custodial wallet on Ethereum and various other blockchains to it, and you can swap with another through a decentralized market maker service. But guess who the backers of the protocol were? Well, it was all Silicon Valley VCs. So approximately, they launched token, and it was announced by Chainalysis, if you saw the report, that about 90% of all decentralized autonomous organization DAO votes are actually conducted by approximately 1% of token holders. So Silicon Valley tends to own that because they forward run all the retail investors. They negotiate better deals for themselves, so people can slap a logo and say this is decentralized and this VC invested. They end up with all the tokens, and I'm sure the SEC is going to be reporting all sorts of shenanigans with pumps and dumps. So Wall Street and VCs tend to invest in those things. And so maybe you'll get the VC lobby, because the VC lobby does have significant influence alongside that as well. So maybe the VC lobby will come in as these go through the cases, but there'll be more and more things. We will learn more and we'll get a lot more clarity, which is good for the market, especially now many people are building such things on top of Bitcoin. But obviously, Bitcoin's not proof of stake, so you can't control the network by owning the tokens. So it has more of a decentralized dynamic to it. And so that's the type of thing that we're seeing with Uniswap. And if they classify them as securities, remember, this will have disruption in Wall Street itself. Because then you have to give disclosures, much like at Bank to the Future, whenever we offer, funding in equities in Bitcoin companies and some of the largest companies, we have to disclose. Well, the same would happen with the tokens, but we shall see. And so, we'll see what happens with that. You can also expect crypto to, come up again in terms of attacks on blockchains through stable coins. We've covered that in previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. We won't go too deep into that today. Another one that happened this week was Mango Markets, which was an $110 million fraud case. I think the guy that got convicted as guilty is called Eisenberg. And he was convicted as guilty for manipulating the futures market in their own token in order to withdraw crypto at inflated collateral prices. And he was convicted guilty of commodities fraud, wire fraud, and market manipulation. Many of the things that Alex Mashinsky is being convicted of, and SBF also got convicted with. Now, in this case, he's facing up to 40 years in prison. Mashinsky was facing up to 115 years in prison. SBF was facing up to 115 years in prison, but he ended up getting approximately 25 years, which will probably be about 12 to 15 years on good behavior from my understanding. In reaction to that, we had new bills proposed in the US for new stablecoin regulations. And these would prohibit algorithmic stablecoins because it requires them all to be backed by cash and cash equivalents. Now, I wonder why they want to do that. Because the $150 billion of stablecoins is mainly backed by US treasuries, which supports the debt market, which is disruptive to the banking market because you're circumventing banks in the middle. And rather than the banks, brokers being able to issue government debt, they're simply going direct from the government to the stablecoin, which is a form of full reserve banking, which is how I got involved in this whole thing 20 years ago. And before finding Bitcoin, trying to create full reserve banking. It required Bitcoin to be created until that innovation got created. And now the world is operating without banks as a result of it. But remember, banks is kind of a decentralized way in itself of forming crony capitalism. And we'll cover more in the second half of how crony capitalism in 1913 took over the banking system and capitalism in many of the Western democracies. And those trends are being called into question as we transition to a Bitcoin and central bank digital currency world. At the same time, in the UK, the previous empire, the creator of the Great British Pound proof of weapons network that co-opted the financial system in 1694 with the creation of the Bank of England that was copied by other Western democracies and was used by those powers that be to create the Federal Reserve against the wish of the US government in order to take over the financial system of the US for the last 100 odd years, over 100 years. Well, the UK is now creating stablecoin regulations, staking regulations, exchange regulations, and custody regulations. 10 years after I gave Boris Johnson the Bitcoin plan, where he laughed me out of the room, as I explained how to transition away from the dependency upon banks after the last global financial crisis. They plan to implement these by July 2024. And at the same time, on Friday, when Iran launched its retaliation on Israel, we got massive deleveraging of the Bitcoin and crypto futures market, where almost $2 billion of leverage was wiped out of Bitcoin. It brought the price of Bitcoin down to approximately $61,000, but it really took out a bunch of the leverage, and it was much like a Bitcoin reset. Which brings us over to this week in macro. This week, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, says, remember he was telling us, everybody, to pump the markets to try and get the 2024 election cycle supportive of Biden, because Jerome Powell certainly doesn't like Trump. And there is a fiscal and monetary union, even though the monetary policy is meant to be independent. We all know that it's not. He said, after trying to manipulate interest rates down and telling everybody that there would be 3 basis points. And then remember, State Street came up and said they predicted it would be 150-point cuts. Well, they said, Jerome Powell said, recent data shows that there has not been further progress on inflation, i.e., there may be a reversal of that policy, and we may need to do that. What else came from the Fed? Well, another official from the Federal Reserve said that it may not be until 2025 that they lower interest rates, which means that they are going to do whatever they can to support Biden in not allowing an inflationary cycle tear away, so that Trump can pretend that he won't just do anything different, and Trump can try and win that election by saying, you see, he created inflation again. Remember, this week was also tax day, 15th of April. Normally, there's a massive sell-off in Bitcoin and equities as a result. That came right after the escalation as well. And really, the commodities took a retaliation after that. And remember, all that tax money is just going to go straight if the Congress that has been lobbied by the Israel lobby that has invested millions and millions and millions into each and every congressperson means the money will go straight back to Israel in order to fund that war. And Ukraine and Zelensky, and Netanyahu are all competing to try and take taxpayers' money in the US so that they can play wealth inequality, make sure the money ends up in the hands of the military-industrial complex, and creates inflation to pump the stock prices and real estate prices at the expense of the middle class, and you will pay through higher tax and inflation. Thank you very much, Zelensky and Netanyahu. At the same time, OPEC was still committed to lowering the oil supplies in Saudi Arabia as well. If you didn't watch the video last week, it was very popular in terms of people understanding because it got ahead of helping people understand how the central bank of oil works. We also got some of the central banks in many of the markets and emerging markets buying gold, which pushed the price of gold up to new all-time highs, and then it corrected slightly, but it's playing around the $2,400 level. Now, some of the central banks that are victims of excessive US dollar loans and debt, weapons, and mass destructions from the IMF, like Zimbabwe, they decided that they're actually going to launch yet another new currency, but this time backed by gold. They're launching a new note, which is about to become worthless again, probably, with $1 trillion notes coming to existence that have already, this year alone, lost 3/4 of their value. Youch! That is painful. The proof of weapons network does it again and destroys the wealth, pushing everyone into dollars so that dollar dominance can push excessive government debt to roll over the Ponzi scheme to try and shift the change in empire and launch financial weapons of mass destruction through the IMF globally in order to destroy central banks and other economies so that the US can benefit, and then it pushes all of that wealth into the wealthiest 1% and exports that inflation globally. I'm going to cover more on the US fuel and energy market next week. Let me know in the comments section if you would like me to cover that, because there is really interesting intersection between the energy independence of US at the moment, the inflation side, and the industry that has grown in Texas with Bitcoin mining as well. Let me know in the comments section if you'd be interested in doing that. I'm thinking of doing US next week and then China the week after so that we are fully prepared. I'm also going to be creating a very nice animated video series to be launched very soon to help everyone put all this together so they can protect themselves in this transition to a Bitcoin and CBDC world as the proof of weapons network escalates itself. Make sure you're on the newsletter at simondixon.com. I won't be releasing that on YouTube, so make sure that you've got a free login on the Bitcoin HardTalk membership portal on simondixon.com in order to be ready for that. I've got the team working on it so that you can have a nice, more condensed version rather than listening to my weekly ramblings where I get very excited about geeky things, and I hope I build a little community that are finance geeks just like me. Right, so US oil reserves are now down to their lowest rate since the 1980s, and US is only holding at the moment about 2 weeks of petroleum reserves. So there is a mad scramble for US to say, I know you've bought all of our Congress members, so Congress is voting in favor of Israel, but at the same time, we have our own political goals. So Netanyahu, please control yourself. We don't want to create World War III, even though you want us to fight for you in this war. And that brings us to the geopolitical updates, because US unequivocally backing Israel is destroying the US economy at the same time and pushing those reserves down to 2 weeks, where they need cooperation with Saudi Arabia and therefore need excessive government debt, transitioning away from capitalism to crony capitalism. Now the government is responsible for about 40% of the economy. And even the US doesn't even believe in freedom anymore. The land of the free voted against the rest of the world who wanted an independent Palestine state in order to de-escalate. But instead, They're saying, Biden's saying we want a two-state solution and then voting against a two-state solution as an American policy. So US oil sanctions are now on the rise as a result of this. So what do? Well, they slap up more sanctions in Venezuela, the world's largest oil producer. But if you watched last week, you know that Saudi Arabia is in second place. However, Saudi Arabia can extract oil a lot cheaper and there's a lot easier process for refining its oil. But Venezuela has actually the largest supply. So essentially, in order to support Saudi Arabia in this new alliance that America needs to follow, now that it is the largest producer of oil in America, we'll cover more on that next week, it puts excessive sanctions on Venezuela, which they've admitted they've been doing for decades of sanctions, which has failed to actually help the process. And all it's done is push Venezuela closer to Russia, China, and Iran on the geopolitical front. But they started to increase those sanctions to push us more into this multipolar world, which is a good thing, because now that means that rather than having this ginormous US foreign policy that is sending US bankrupt, which I really don't want to happen, I'd much rather have a more multipolar world rather than this excessive control that causes all this instability. And at the same time, Argentina's picking its side. So Argentina said that it was going to have a Bitcoin policy. It didn't have a Bitcoin policy. Instead, it handed over its entire monetary policy to the Fed, which is probably better run than the Argentina side. But it wasn't the central bank that created the mess. It was the excessive IMF dependency upon the US that created a financial weapon of mass destruction and destroyed the economy despite having rich resources. And so Argentina is now fully dependent upon the Fed, and it has now decided to apply to become a partner of NATO so that it can have the defense alliance against the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore, and expanded to the Cold War in Russia. And so we also had Iran decided that obviously the news that happened just after the broadcast. If you remember the broadcast, I was saying it could have happened now, anytime. Suddenly they said it was like a surprise, even though Iran announced the retaliation, gave sufficient warning to the US. Anyway, Iran retaliated and it striked hard against Israel, but it did it just on military targets. Essentially, it went through and penetrated one military base, was damaged. Some say there was more. This was a retaliation to the 7 deaths that happened on the Israeli escalation. Israel kind of said, it wasn't an escalation, and everyone's using those types of excuses, and everyone's arguing over who is creating the escalation. But Iran gave a warning about it. That's how we knew about it, and we covered it on Bitcoin Hard Talk before it happens. But I think this was a good de-escalation opportunity. We shall see. And I'm going to cover in the second half the consequences of not de-escalating on this one, that ever since October the 7th, I've been trying to warn people. People have been telling me to stay in my lane, but it impacts macro, it impacts Bitcoin. And I hope you understand now that you're seeing that as more and more people are watching the show, realizing actually that thing I asked you not to talk about is actually a Bitcoin play. But don't worry, I'm used to it. When I first started talking about banking, everyone told me to stay in my lane and that it's not relevant. When I pivoted to talking about Bitcoin in 2011, everyone said, stay on your lane on banking reform. Bitcoin's irrelevant. And as I started talking more about geopolitics, everyone said, I just want to hear you talking about Bitcoin. But I'm just giving you what I know you need rather than what you want. And hopefully this all plays out as it did just with banking reform, with Bitcoin, and the geopolitical side on the proof of weapons network being the primary user case in the next cycle as Bitcoin becomes a geopolitical tool as war likely escalates. I'm going to take a quick water break. If you like this, do me a favor. Retweet this if you're watching on Twitter and get some more people to join us. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button, hit the bell symbol, hit all, subscribe, and YouTube will send you a notification because YouTube is shadow banning us from now on. Let me preserve my voice. Do that right now. 1, 2, 3, hit like. Okay, the reason that I think this could be a de-escalation is Iran got to show its military power. Israel got to show its defense. And a bunch of allies spent all of the money so that Israel didn't need to, because Israel owns political influence over US Congress. So there was no deaths. That's a great thing. We definitely don't want Israelis to die, as we don't want Palestinians to die. And no matter what someone says, calling you anti-Semitic, and when people call me anti-Semitic, even though half my family is Jewish, it is because I don't want Israelis or Iranians or Americans or Brits to have to fight this futile war in order to expand this genocidal mission that we are seeing, that is scamming us into escalating. So the Security Council all met, and unfortunately, as a show of distaste, Russia walked out of the United Nations just before the Israeli minister, whatever we call that, decided that he was speaking, and there was a vote, and the entire world voted for peace and a Palestinian state, but US decided to veto it, even though, as I said, they're claiming they want a two-state solution. So remember, American leadership are saying one thing to get the popular vote because we all hate war, but they are following their masters that own Congress right now and compromising US democracy and changing First Amendment rights in order to ensure that this escalates, because the United States, in detracting the Iran retaliation, spent over $1 billion of taxpayers' money intercepting in order for Israel to say, we show our military might. And all of their different allies that wanted to normalize also allowed that to happen. And Israel only spent $110 million intercepting those missiles. And of course, the US veto against Palestine, as we said, and Israel and Iran are essentially responding today, and we started to get the retaliation by Israel. And those Israel retaliation is essentially hoping that it's a de-escalation, because there's a Jewish holiday this weekend for everybody that celebrates. Happy Passover. It's coming next week. And it decided to do a retaliation before the holiday, and it was in Iran, in Syria, and in Iraq as well. So we will see. Now, the good news is that both Israel and Iran are treating this as a quiet event. You're not hearing the governments confirm it, which is a good sign, because Israel can now say we spent America's money and we look strong. Iran can say we didn't kill any people, we just wanted to show what we got. And Saudi Arabia decided that they would not condemn, and they stayed silent on the matter. And we have the perfect opportunity to de-escalate. However, Israel took the opportunity to expand its settler colonialism, and it started to approve ginormous land grabs on the West Bank to steal more land and put more Jewish settlers and Iranian and Israeli settlers on their land, which is an escalation back to the advancement in Rafah that America has said we don't support. And so we shall see what happens next. But now we turn into the second half, because Russia made a big announcement as well. Because Iran is less strong on its air defense, and Russia said that it would support Iran in order to protect itself from any airstrikes and retaliation from Israel. So this is a chance for the whole world to take this down, de-escalate, and we shall see what happens next. And I'm going to share in part 2, if you're enjoying this, why I think it's so important with all the historical context and how this could all relate together, and why everybody, I believe, not financial advice, needs to have their own Bitcoin hedge, their company Bitcoin hedge, their sovereign Bitcoin hedge, and their central bank Bitcoin hedge as well, in case this escalates. So anyway, apparently there were 3 drone strikes today and no government announcements as of yet. Maybe that will change as I'm watching this. This is all happening in real time. And then we got the escalation where, or maybe de-escalation, I'm hoping, where Israel did those strikes at Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So as we said, we've got that 1 week holiday and we shall see what happens. Iran said that they're investigating whether they think this is a retaliation. And so we will see further announcements. Now, with that in mind, just like last week, where we covered the importance of Saudi Arabia, today I want to cover the historical importance to understand, because the media is going to scam you into thinking this is something that it's not, but the importance of the relations between Iran, Israel, and Russia by me following, you know how I do things, I follow the money in order to try and understand what the next moves might be just based upon the monetary flows and looking at the geopolitical situation, so that then we can decide what we're going to do and become better investors and prepare ourselves accordingly before it's too late. So if you like that, hit the like button. I'm going to take more water, and then we're going to jump straight into the second half. Okay, so let's set the scene. We need to rewind to last year. The US, UK, and EU military industrial complexes benefited significantly from many Ukrainians and Russians dying as a result of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. They sent tanks, they sent guns, they sent armory, they sent numerous different types of equipment that was produced in EU, UK, and US. US printed the money, created inflation, got the US taxpayer to pay for it, and the money went straight back into the coffers of the US, EU, and UK military industrial complex, so that Russia could essentially not, destroy everything immediately. So we got that whole parade where Zelensky was getting all US taxpayers to create inflation and essentially try and defend against this situation. Boris Johnson, if you remember, went out there to try and not allow peace to happen so that military industrial complex could benefit and they could expand the growth of those proof of weapons network at the expense of Ukrainian and Russian lives. Remember, Russia has more than 3 times the population of Ukraine. And so Russia can just simply replace people. More people can die as more of US taxpayers' money is sent over to Ukraine. And then Russia can find it easier to replace their losses in manpower. But Ukraine can beg everybody and try and get the ability to replace losses in their equipment that Russia's blowing up. And America gets to try and weaken Russia's power, but at the expense of Ukrainian and Russians' lives. And Ukraine gets to, replenish those supplies. And the US, UK, and EU military industrial complex, they get to take all the money, and then the taxpayers pay. And then that creates inflation in the proof of weapons Ponzi scheme that I've covered many times. The US then gets to export its inflation globally, issue more IMF loans. That then depletes and destroys currencies like we're seeing in Egypt, in Pakistan, in Lebanon, and any country, even Ukraine, that has excessive IMF debt. Russia obviously got cut off and isolated from all of the world trade with the EU as a result of the sanctions, that there was retaliation. And essentially, Russia had to replace all of those tanks, all of those already military equipment, and most importantly, microchips, which are required because now the military industrial complex is an AI war in more advanced weapons and systems that continue in order to continue the fight in what is now really a 21st century war, where AI, just like this happening in Israel right now through technologies like Lavender, is deciding which civilians to blow up and which equipment to replace in order to feed and fuel the military industrial complexes. But if you remember, in about winter of 2022-23, we started to see a significant shift. And the media started to pick up on different types of weapons that were being used in Ukraine from Russia. And that was because they were being purchased from Iran's military industrial complex instead. And they were buying these drones that were called kamikaze drones. And suddenly the technology really stepped up, and that was being used, as we are seeing on the news all the time now, as Russia starts to destroy more of the infrastructure in Ukraine. And guess what? The IMF is going to be issuing all the loans in order to redevelop Ukraine. And they're going to try and make sure Israel gets all those settlements in Palestine so that IMF loans can be used in order to redevelop. And when they redevelop, they'll be putting in the technology in order to launch their central bank digital currencies with all of the different command and control technology that was developed in Israel and used to perform the illegal occupation by all of the technology that was used in the occupation as a service that Israel has been selling abroad and brought in approximately $12 billion in revenue as a result of selling occupation and the beta test in destroying and killing Palestinians and their life. But obviously, Iran started to develop a lot of that weaponry, and that is leading to more Ukrainians being killed to weaken Russia so that America can perform its NATO expansion, bring in more members. Argentina becomes a member. They then have to borrow money from the IMF so they can spend it back in America. That fuels the debt-based cycle, retaliates with inflation abroad, as we've said. And by the way, I love to repeat just because I think repetition is the mother of all understanding in these complex flows. But essentially, that's the way the money flows around the system. And obviously, that creates more inflation, and you have rich-poor divide and excessive debt from those that are not benefiting because the military-industrial complex does that as well. And that's similar to what we saw in Israel, last weekend, where you saw these drones being able to defend, and it becomes more and more of US involvement, and it costs US taxpayers as a result. Okay. So, I'd like to give a little bit of the history and how much have we got left? So I said I'd go on. We've got about another 15 minutes to get through to on the hour. But I'd like to give a little bit more of the history in terms of why, so that you can be preparing next as well. But essentially, these weapons are coming from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, which is known as the IRGC. And that is the military wing of Iran, and Iran is supplying those to Russia. So in addition to all of these kamikaze drones that we're seeing, Iran is providing those to Russia. And we're starting to see, different types of all sorts of other missiles and stuff, which is also being exported across to Russia. And this is all coming from the Iranian military industrial complex, which is supporting Russia right now, while the US and the EU military industrial complexes, which are all private companies, they support Ukraine. And so they benefit, as we said, and this provides essentially the profits for Iran to then defend itself and fight Israel, while Israel escalates, tries and brings in US, and the military industrial complex benefits, as it costs eventually probably US life if Israel gets its way. So then you have essentially the Russia-Iran military alliance that is protecting the region. And then you have the Russian Federation that is becoming the most sanctioned country in the world after the 2022 sanctions on the planet, which then draws it closer to the second most sanctioned country, which is now Iran. And we had additional sanctions on Iran after last week's escalation, which means that Iran and Russia have no choice but to trade with each other. And as US starts to propose, and UK, more sanctions on China, that then draws China closer to Iran and Russia, and they all start trading with each other. Hence why we have the BRICS alliance, where they're saying the only way we break this cycle is to stop trading with each other in dollars, even if we don't get on, even if we're not ideologically aligned, so that they can then trade with each other in Chinese yuan or their local currencies. and they create central bank digital currencies in order to support those essentially trade routes. And so all it does in the end is draw them closer so that they trade with each other. And we end up in this multipolar world that we have seen. Essentially, Russia also then agrees to export more to Iran. So if you look at the stats, the Russian exports to Iran have actually increased 27% since Russia invaded Ukraine as a result of those sanctions. And Iran is now exporting to Russia more than 10% since the Ukrainian-Russian invasion. So that's why you got an uptick in de-dollarization, so that they can stop settling in dollars as a result of those trades. Russia agreed to invest $40 billion in helping Iran's natural gas infrastructure. So remember, as we transition from an oil world to an electricity world, just as the fiat proof of weapons network backed by oil and military industrial complex transitions to a CBDC world and a Bitcoin world, which is then powered by electricity, which is a resistance movement against the proof of weapons, military industrial complex, proof of weapons, fiat currency, Ponzi schemes. This helps Russia, essentially. They also helped Russia, launch a satellite, which happened in August. And the US Pentagon intelligence said that is helping, decide which of these Irans are going to be used in order to launch strikes in Ukraine. So you can see that this is now moving to technological warfare, where proxy wars are being used and lives are being cost in the middle in order to test these military mights that we are seeing. Essentially, a little bit of history, as I said I was going to get into. Remember that Iran and Russia they all fought each other with side by side in Syria against the Saudi Arabia and US. So remember, there was an occupation of US that in Syria was able to take over certain oil fields with the help of Saudi Arabia. The US would provide the military might to Saudi Arabia. The US would then occupy it, and they would have money that exists outside Congress that they could use with the CIA in order to push lawless types of missions. And that's where we got accusations that the US CIA and Mossad, in the case of Israeli intelligence, was being used to push that four-letter and the enemy of Iran, that's called IS. I won't say the full thing and the rest of it because YouTube will ban. And so we started to see those being used. And remember the attacks that we saw this year, those attacks by those entities, you know who I'm talking about, that I won't say, they happened on Iran, and they happened with the Moscow attacks and terrorist attacks in Russia at the moment. That they believe was a retaliation as a result of Russia and Iran providing more of those, fighter jets to each other, and there's more drones and more advanced people. I've been trying to learn from those involved in the military industrial complex so that I can combine it with my understanding of the financial flows, because I'm not a military expert, but I've been trying to learn from those that are those military experts as well. This is the types of trends that we are receiving and we're seeing right now. So, they're using them to defend each other. More research is being implanted into, remember, what the US attack on Iran was in the first place, because they don't want them to have military and nuclear might. Because Israel says, we want illegal nuclear weapons that we don't disclose, but we don't want Iran to have them, because Iran, remember, in its 1979 revolution, when it changed, it became less of an American ally, and Iran became an enemy essentially after that. But it's pushing it more to this alliance with Iran, Russia, and China as a result. So the history. Just after World War II, essentially, Nazi Germany was an enemy of the Soviet Union. And, Britain and the Soviets were jointly involved in the, and round about 1941, about a few years after that, they were aligned. So remember, Russia was aligned in that. And remember that together, the Soviet Unions, they toppled the Shah in Iran. So before it was a monarchy. Remember, after World War I, Britain implanted all of its monarchies, its UK-friendly monarchies, and just split the Middle East up. And essentially, those monarchies ruled by violence. And just like, the monarchy, it didn't have a democracy or decentralized government or anything like that. And so it was the Iran that was the allied forces against the Shah at that time. Soviet Union would basically remain the occupying force in up till 1946. And Iran, sorry, just checking some of the notes as well to make sure I've got all this. And so basically the Shah in Iran was known as pro-West, pro-US, pro-Israel at the time. They were essentially opposed to communism in the Middle East. And so at that time, Iran and Russia and the Soviet Union at the time were pitted against each other. Now, remember the different ideologies. I covered this in previous videos. Just as a little bit of a recap, I'm probably going to go a little bit over in order to cover this as well so that we can get right back to where we are today. Remember the different types of ideologies. So the Soviet Union at the time, which later became the Russian Federation at the fall of the Soviet Union, was a communist ideology. A communist ideology is big government. It always fails. And it's you can't have private property ownership rights. And it is oppressive regimes where government control everything. The US ideology in the post-World War II, after the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, America was built upon an ideology of free markets and capitalism. But when they lost the battle against the central bank in 1913, it became crony capitalism, where the dollar became a debt-based Ponzi scheme. It removed its backing by the dollar, and debt slavery became the methodology of transitioning the US from free market capitalism over to crony capitalism, where the closer you are to controlling the debt and being able to borrow at 0% from the central bank, the more you are able to control the system at the expense of everybody else. And they paid the highest interest rates on credit card and payday loans. And so you get that wealth transfer, and then the government gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so America is in that transition from capitalism to crony capitalism. And then if you remember the Islamic finance video that I created, I know some people don't care about Islamic finance, but Islamic ideology was in the middle, where it's based upon complete free trade, but obviously it has some religious types of ideologies on top of that. But it is an anti-debt movement as well, because it essentially Islamic economics believes in hard money like Austrian economics, and rather than using debt, which is the US model in the debt-based Ponzi scheme, it uses equity and profit sharing as the predominant ideology in the financial system. If you were interested in that topic, go to the Islamic finance video that I created in a previous episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Some of you don't care about it, but then you can understand some of these ideologies and some of the things that are happening right now. And so essentially in the 1960s and 70s, Imperial Iran, that had a monarchy, was aligned and became the US police for the Middle East. And so they were pro-Israeli, which was also the US ally. And obviously, as I've said previously, the US, as long as it has capitalism in its own country, it implements crony capitalism and foreign policies so that those in the US can benefit from the terrorism and atrocities that happen in other countries, obliterated and inflicted by the CIA and other things. So remember, we then had the Persian Gulf, where essentially it was taking over some of the oil reserves. And so we had the expansion. And then 1979, leading into that, we had the Islamic revolutionary movement, and the Shah was toppled. And so to understand some of the politics in Iran at the moment, you have those that support the previous monarchy, which are called the monarchs, let's call it, and those that support the Islamic revolution, and essentially the other nations around, which are, so you have those that, those geopolitical tensions or those domestic tensions with those that support the Islamic revolution, which is enforced through the Guard, the IRGC, and those that support the previous Shahs and the monarchy as well. And so you'll hear about more and more of that as you progress deeper and deeper into the geopolitical understanding as well. So the pro-American Shah was essentially toppled in that 1969 revolution, and that changed the dynamics of everything. And this is when we started to see some of the Israeli lobby against Iran, and then some of those war escalations as a result, because essentially the new Islamic Republic of Iran, or Iran became the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they wanted to remove US foreign bases and the US military industrial complex from the Middle East. They also announced that they wanted to support Palestine instead of Israel in their struggle against the illegal occupation and the expansion of the illegal settlements from Israel, was grabbing land and evicting people in Palestine from the West Bank. And also it was happening in some of the Syrian territories as well. And so Syria became somebody that became aligned as well. And that helps you understand some of the relations between Syria and Iran right now. And I want to make sure that we got time to cover. Sorry if I go a little bit longer, because I want you to understand the equation with Iraq in that equation, and then how that comes back to Russia, so that we can understand whether we're going to get de-escalation or re-escalation, and then obviously the Bitcoin hedge and everything that's happening as it all affects each other in the current environment that we're seeing right now. So what happened during the Iranian Revolution is essentially Iran, or the Iran Republic, handed the keys over from the Israeli embassy, and made it a Palestinian embassy ever since. It decided that Israel wanted to extend its settlements at the same time and remove more of the Palestinians from their land. It considered that a part that had the right to return in order to come into Israel. And so the Palestinian cause became the central of this conflict. And even the international community at the time said that Israel's expansive settlements are completely illegal under international law. And that was the consensus at the time. Only Israel disputed that them stealing land from Palestine and, expelling people through violence, the Palestinians through violence, was legal and something that they could actually do. Now, remember, we had announcements this week that Israel is going to expand, and it had a conference where it was going to start to expand its settlements into Gaza as well, now that it's completely obliterated 85% of all the infrastructure, all the hospitals, all the buildings, and everything. And also remember, originally, around this time, Israel was providing the funding for Hamas because it wanted to destabilize the region as well. We covered that on my video on who funded Hamas right in the beginning of this conflict. So now obviously Iran supports that. That was a bit of the side that evolved. And that's why when it happened, October the 7th was simply a continuation of a greater policy that was designed at getting US involved and being able to expand those settlements and just completely obliterate Palestine, as Netanyahu showed when he held up the map, just before October the 7th, showing a new vision for the Middle East that completely wiped Palestine off the map, that led to the escalation when there was previously, prior to October the 7th, about 5 other October the 7th inflicted upon the Palestinian people. But obviously the media didn't get behind those as well. Now, remember that this time as well, there was also expansions from Israel into Syria in order to displace people. And there were those, Golan Heights, which were the regions that were kind of classified as illegal occupations. Right. Now, fast forward from that, that's the framework. And then I want to tie this all together with Russia. So be patient with me. I hope you're enjoying this. A lot of history. I try to pick out the relevant parts. I'm a geek, so I think it's all relevant. But now let's move forward to this. When Trump got elected, for the first time, he supported the illegal settlements and the expansion of Israel and became the only country in the world other than Israel that decided international law doesn't matter. And guess what? A lot of his campaign was funded by AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, and that made it, then he supported in United Nations. And in 2019, the US decided to support for the first time these illegal settlements. Then, the Biden administration later, and by the way, the Biden administration, don't take this as me supporting Biden over Trump, certainly don't. Biden needs to be expelled for the atrocities that is enabled to happen under his watch. But I just want you to know that it makes no difference whether Trump gets in or Biden gets in, because Biden actually reversed that stance on illegal settlements, and it was taken to the ICJ court, and every country agreed that this is destabilizing, this is completely illegal. And even the countries that support it just said, well, we don't want to say it's not illegal because we don't want to harm any of the negotiations. But essentially, US decided that it would completely obliterate any relations with Iran after the Iranian Revolution in '69. And this new policy created 4 decades of essentially sanctioning and making enemies with Iran and ensuring that it doesn't have a nuclear weapon while supporting Israel and having an illegal weapon when Iran wanted to do that because it believes that it was looking at things like North Korea, where nobody invaded North Korea because having a nuclear weapon levels the playing field and it stops people wanting to do things like illegal, expansive settlements and various other things. Okay, right. So remember, after essentially this meant that so remember we had the Iran essentially had a war with Iraq. We know all the Iraq story as well. Sorry if I'm skipping through a few of these things, trying to make sure we catch it all in. But essentially the support was withdrawn. Then we moved over to the Saddam Hussein era as well. Sorry if I'm jumping back and forth. Just want to make sure you understand, bring it back to where we are today. That was where Iraq invaded Iran in the 1980s. That led to essentially Iraq coming after territories which had 90% of all the oil of Iran. So remember, these are all territorial expansions in order to control some of these geopolitical corridors. And that eventually led to essentially the invasion of Iraq into Iran, which was funded by billions following the money of dollars. And all of that funding came from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. And so this started to create, this different division as a result of destabilizing. And you know what happened with Kuwait and Iraq after as well. So essentially, all Arab monarchies who feared a similar toppling of the dictatorial monarchies, they didn't want any type of revolution. They didn't want any toppling of those monarchies. So they started to more align with US foreign policy, which was enabled through Israel. And that was started to create this multi-corridor that, was really the beginning of this whole fight between the monarchies and the revolutionaries. And so you started to have this division between Iran and Saudi Arabia as they became more and more powerful now fast forwarding that to where we are right now. If you remember, Last year, there was a big problem because China stepped in. And remember, we covered this on previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. And rather than allowing America to sidestep Iran and normalize between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and remove Palestine and support the new vision for the Middle East, China came in and normalized between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then the BRICS corridor came along. And in retaliation, this was a retaliation to the Abraham Accords. And this is why we ended up with October the 7th, with significantly more funding getting into the Palestinian cause. And then obviously at that time, remember, Netanyahu tried to scam the world by saying that the resistance movement was the same as that four-letter word institution, and confusing people where everyone thought Iran was that four-letter institution that did the terrorism attacks on Iran and Russia this year, because they were enabled by the CIA and Mossad in order to escalate, those different things, as all intelligence agencies have used over time. And then we talked about how Netanyahu shared up that vision for the Middle East. So essentially, the revolutionary movement, it sent shockwaves across all of the monarchs. All of the monarchs didn't want anything like that to happen, and so they aligned with the US. And then we had a couple of different corridors as well. Now we get to how and why Iran and Russia are aligned. This happened really after the expansion of Iran. Basically, they needed corridors in order to be able to export their military industrial complex to its allies. So they supported, for example, Iran was able to support some of the proxy forces by getting equipment to Afghanistan in fighting against some of the Soviet forces. In 1989, I've covered too much here. I thought it would be going, but I'm just going to carry on because I want to, and I'm going to make this go on longer. But remember, there was in 1989, there was a decade of failed wars with the Soviets. They had to withdraw from Afghanistan. And then 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Then we had the Russian Federation that took over, which wasn't communism. And so while it had much of the communist ideals, it emerged as it's more embracing capitalism. And so that allowed basically these different ideologies to cooperate a little bit more. By 2000, essentially, Iran at this time became the largest customer in the world of Russian-created weapons. So now this alliance started to come as communism started to break down. And by 2007, Russia agreed begin to supplying Iran with lots of missile defense systems. This obviously increased sanctions. And at this point, remember, there was a civil war in Syria, and Syria opposed the Israeli occupation that happened with the Syrian Golan Heights as those settlements started to expand that we talked about earlier. And so, this started to lead to some of those occupations and civil wars that happened. And remember, in 2011, that kind of took the Middle East by storm when you had the Arab Springs, which was all sorts of revolutionary movements against the monarchies ruling across the Middle East, which led to all sorts of craziness, and the monarchy thinking that this may be a de-toppling of those regimes. And so that made, of course, Iran public enemy number one again, an expansion of sanctions, which pushed Iran and Russia to have to work together further. But essentially, these large territorial disputes were with Israel, their greatest ally, US, and then it starts to get real involvement in US and Israeli politics that we started to see this. So essentially, in exchange for the Soviet military and finance aid in Syria, so remember, the Soviets supported aid to Syria. They were granted the Soviets basically a naval right. So this is really important. Within Syria, because Russia supported the Syrian civil war and supported the Assad regime, they were given a right to a port in Syria that became geopolitically very significant. This essentially enabled Russian weapons and submarines to be, to be able to get and be exported through the Mediterranean Sea. I wish I had a map to show you, but hopefully you can say, imagine Syria here. Syria gave Russia a port. Just like, remember what you're seeing right now, where America's trying to use this in order to build a port into Gaza right now, saying that it's to get aid in, but they're supporting a permanent occupation and permanent port. Well, in Syria, Russia was able to use a similar strategy through their military-industrial complex in order to get a port that allowed them to export to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this is why, and I'm going to come back, I promise. This allowed, I'm famous for saying this as well, but this allowed Russia to export without having to go through these crazy NATO-aligned member states. Before, they had to go through Turkey, different regions, go all the way around, and at every port, they would get risk of one of the NATO countries deciding to slap a sanction and disrupt that. This port became important and geopolitically important for the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was able to exert control. As there was a civil war in Syria in 2011, Russia was able to provide and support the regime. And this was able to leave to them having that geopolitically, support. And then Russia then had their naval ability to operate in the Mediterranean Sea and not have NATO in the way. Now we know that background. So remember what we got. Israel, when they launched their retaliatory attack, it was on the Iraq, it was on Iran, and it was on Syria. So Syria is geopolitically significant for Russia. And remember, in about 2015, Russia deployed actual troops there. They deployed about 70,000 soldiers in 2015. And so Russia was granted that full sovereign rights, full control over that port for 49 years, regardless of any Syrian war. So they've got, war or law at all. And so up to 2066, it still has free charge, completely free access to that port and jurisdiction over that within Syria. Now, remember, let's start looking at the Iran side. So Iran geopolitically had alliances with Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and these became the key allies to Iran on what you will see called the axis of resistance. Now, remember that famous speech with George Bush, where he came out and called it the axis of evil, because this was all over these ports and NATO being able to have more control over those Russian corridors. So basically, Syria became like a prominent and important part of the war. And so obviously when Israel started expanding some of those, that creates and expands the conflict. US, they already said that they will unequivocally defend Israel. And so US, they put massive sanctions across Syria in order to try and weaken the Russia and Iranian corridors that could happen to create this multipolar world as well. Remember, Syria has never recognized Israel. And so obviously they got more and more sanctions of that, these financial weapons of mass destruction, and that pushed them closer and closer and closer to Iran and Syria having to pull back against the US And they remember their stated goal at Syria is the same as Iran, which is to remove the US foreign policy from the Middle East so that America can just get back to America first policies rather than defending Israel and defending all the oil ports and the CIA engaging in all these terrorist attacks across the Middle East. So really, Syria was just, standing. Now, remember, I keep saying remember, I'm introducing new information, but we obviously all know that Iran intervened to overtopple Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein and Iraq were the only thing that was standing between Syria and Iran in the Middle East. And so when you had the first US invaded the Gulf War, obviously that happened in 1991, in order to get my dates wrong, right? And essentially that really disrupted the plans that Iraq had to try and dominate approximately half the world's oil by expanding and overtoppling Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then America, basically, they finished the job of completely eliminating Saddam Hussein and Iraq in 2003. And so, that led to, remember how they did that? The lie of weapons of mass destruction, when they already had dismantled those weapons of mass destruction within Iraq, and they knew full well, but they scammed the world into thinking that that was the reason. And essentially, the US spent about 8 years, basically, all the end result is it achieved all of Iran's goals in Iraq. So instead of their own. So instead of the US achieving what they wanted, essentially they occupied Iraq for about 8 years. It was a massive military mistake for US. And all they did, the end result is they ended up creating Iran being able to have this free passage through Iraq in order to export their weapons through allied Syria. So now you had Syria in the middle. And so this strengthened Iran because Iraq just became a failed state. And it was only when Russia was there and when Russia decided that it wanted to leave. Why did it leave? Because it wanted to support Ukraine. You ended up with more Iranian power in Iraq and controlling that corridor to Syria. Then Russia has that port, and then it's able to circumvent NATO in order to transport weapons. And that's how they got across to Hezbollah, which essentially was defending the Israeli occupation in Lebanon. And Hezbollah essentially grew more powerful than the Lebanese government itself. Hence why you're getting this friction between Lebanon and Israel at the moment. So what did the US do? Well, the US decided to launch financial weapons of mass destruction on Lebanon. I don't know if you remember the news when it came out, when there was all this talk of corruption, where the central bank of Lebanon had completely collapsed and the government had stolen all the money. Well, remember, this was excessive IMF loans that led to the complete depletion of the dollar reserves and a massive inflationary cycle in Lebanon, destroyed the Lebanese currency. So they then became dependent upon the dollar, and the depletion of all of their dollar reserves meant they had to print more of the Lebanese currency, and it went into an inflationary cycle. And at the same time, just coincidentally, all of these different natural gas routes were being found in different economic regions and economic zones. As we transition from oil to electricity, as natural gas becomes more important, you start to see all of these discoveries of natural gas in territories which Israel was expanding to, including Gaza, as we got more recent announcements over. So essentially, Iran's ability to funnel weapons and supply, these different support to Hezbollah in Lebanon was enabled as a result of this. And if Syria was ever to fall into different hands, then it would be very, very destructive to both Iran and Russia. Hence, the US occupation of certain oil fields that still exist. So remember, they said that they had retreated, but they stayed there because we started to see these different types of escalations as everything started to expand in the war as well. So now you understand why Iran and Russia are completely united in defending their power and their ports and their strategy in Syria to give them independence from NATO, while US tries to expand NATO to sell more weapons in the military industrial complex, as we've covered repeatedly, so it can then put more IMF loans to roll over its Ponzi scheme to destabilize central banks in other countries, as we repeatedly understand. I hope you're starting to understand how the geopolitical situation. So as we transition to CBDCs and Bitcoin, the world that I'm trying to prepare people, and I promise when I do the animated video, I'm going to be a bit more articulate because I get to record it rather than trying to cover lots and lots of different stuff. I'll make sure it gets proofread as well. But I want to give you a sneak peek and preview as they're rolling out in real time. And each week is so eventful at the moment that I'm having to just frantically write lots of notes as I discover things and be able to connect the dots by following the money as well. Okay, always too much content, but I will continue. I hope you're enjoying it. Take a quick water break. And we will persist. We will get through to the end. Right. So we're back to 2022 at least right now. Remember, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This is when we had, what have I got here? This is when, okay, yeah, Russia had to rely on Iran further. I covered this right at the beginning. It seems like a bit of repetition, but just as a recap as well. Remember, Russia had to pull out their troops, and they had to pull out many of their resources and equipment and drones from Syria because it needed to take all of those resources and put it over to the more important, which was their Ukrainian conflict as well. So that basically gave Iran greater control over Iraq, Syria, from there being able to, focus more on the Ukrainian side. Sorry, I start to get confused with all my countries as well. But so that essentially gave more control over to Iran. So as we said, after all of these sanctions, both Russia and Iran, they emerged as the most sanctioned places between each other. The trade between the two countries basically completely accelerated. Russia started to lose access to all the EU market. Remember this? Remember we had the Nord Stream oil explosions. Russia claimed that that was America. That started to remove some of those corridors. Russia started to export more and more of its oil and gas away from Europe. And it started to expand more and more of that over to some of its Asian economies. And so we had China and India become the beneficiaries of all of the oil that and natural gas that used to be exported. China is very dependent upon that Russian oil. And so these sanctions drew them closer and closer. And actually, India started to enter the equation as well. And this is where you get very geopolitically complicated. This is the importance of de-escalation and not acting like a drunken, crazy things, expanding settlements illegally, destabilizing everything. And in Iran, using their military industrial complex, as we have seen, and the proof of weapons network taking us into where we are today. So India actually significantly after the Ukraine invasion started to really expand the amount of oil and gas that it purchased since the invasion. So by the end of 2022, to give you some stats, the trade between India and Russia, it became more than doubled from the year prior. So the year prior to the invasion, it more than doubled. And by the end of 2023, it was projected to increase even further. We're into 2024 now. That had a significant increase. This significantly boosted the Russian economy, and it became the #1 largest supplier of oil and fertilizer across India. India is a significantly growing economy as a result, because Russia gave it a significantly cheaper. Obviously, the demographics in India are a growing population, a growing economy, and now the largest supplier of weapons and equipment to India is the Iranian armed, the Indian armed forces is buying more and more equipment from Russia as well. This is why you've previously heard me quote that about as a result of the sanctions, the debt to GDP ratio in Russia significantly decreased, its balance sheet increased, as the debt to GDP ratio in America got worse and worse and worse because of its expansion in spending in military and its debt recycling and interest and everything that it was. Okay. I mean, that it was already, because India already had that big relationship with Russia as well. And so India and Russia have been working on one more thing, and this is where it pulls Iran into the equation and why we enter a very, very dangerous situation. So remember, this week, Russia announced that it would support the air forces of Iran. Is because the Russia and India relationship, they've been working on a project. Let me get the name of it so I don't get the name wrong. The International North-South Transport Corridor. This is basically a system of railways, of highways, of ships. It allows to transport Russian exports basically to India without having to pass any of the NATO. So remember, Russia's original justification was the NATO expansion and the accusation that this was a US proxy war. Now it's building these corridors in order to avoid these NATO types of corridors as well. This basically, by being able to have this, India can purchase oil and natural gas and fertilizer and Russian exports at about 30% reduced rate. And it can also reduce the costs of travel by about 40%. India basically can keep getting these cheap resources, which is geopolitically significant for its expansive power and to advance their economy. And so Russia can then keep getting cash in and circumvent the Russian financial sanctions. And it draws those relations stronger and stronger and stronger as a result of that. In order to make that happen, Iran, and this is why there is that relation there, even they may not be ideologically aligned with Russia, but Iran is the key intermediary between the Indian and the Russian markets. And so hence you had all those transactions and that movement last year to de-dollarization so that you can expand these infrastructure funding, which is also heavily funded by China and those BRICS corridors. They have their tied loans where you have to, if you want to get hold of Chinese loans, then you have to be able to clear some of those in the Chinese yuan. And that will obviously be central bank digital currencies, because China, and I'll cover that not next week. I'm going to be doing US, then I'll be covering the China stuff and the CBDC stuff. But now, as a result of this, Russian ships can enter Iran, go through Oman, and go straight to India by ship without any of the NATO intervention. So Iran is geopolitically vital to Russia to be able to export its goods to India, and India are aligned because it needs those cheap goods in order to expand its growth and its economy. And as a result of that, as we talked about earlier, from June 2022, Iran was happy to provide Russia with those drones And you started to see a very advanced technological warfare with US trying to get more and more missiles and armor and equipment over to Ukraine. And they became involved in many, many Ukrainian and Russian lives losing because of these two military industrial complexes expansion goals. And that really brings us close to where we are today, because as a result of this, Iran has seen that North Korea is protected and that Russia's protected despite what they do because they have nuclear warfare. Iran wants to have nuclear warfare because it wants to be able to protect itself. And Israel has said to America, you can't let Iran have nuclear warfare, but let us have it illegally. And then these different corridors emerged. And hence, October the 7th was a massive geopolitical run-up to many of the situations if you follow the money and the different corridors. And so that brings us one step closer to where we are today. And we will continue more with next week on the US side, but let's summarize the situation as we are right now. Russia may go one step further to assist them in developing a nuclear weapon. That was previously unheard of right now. Hence, the US wants Israel, to kind of destabilize, and Israel can draw US in. And maybe that's why, because they don't want Russia defending Iran and having a nuclear weapon. Remember, Israel announced that it's going to continue its settlement. And today we obviously had the retaliation in Iraq, Iran, and Syria. If that goes too much further, this essentially could torpedo Russia's relationship with Iran. And then Russia this week announced that it would protect the air, and it would obviously need to protect its, from its rivals. Now, here's the problem. Again, the geopolitical situation. Russia has geopolitically significant relationships with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So any escalation there is what we could have massive destabilization in the oil markets. And the oil markets in 2023 broke the US banking system, took us into an inflationary cycle where the Fed had to reverse its policy on rates, hiked rates, so that people that took on excessive debt in the US housing market and real estate market went bankrupt. And then that led to the mass withdrawals, the maturity mismatch that we covered in other previous things. That is the financial weapon of mass destruction. And that is what needs to be avoided. And that is why the US are saying, Israel, do not go aggressive. We will defend, but we won't allow for any expansionary attack. And Israel has responded by announcing new settlements, which hinders the Palestinian cause. And then Russia have said that they'll protect the air defense. And so that brings us to, the strikes this weekend and the retaliation. All three countries remain important for Russia. So all three countries are now buying Russian weapons, Iran, China, various, and the oil as well. And so all of those countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE were involved in defending the airs for Israel, as they announced. They didn't, they did that. But they have to remain neutral in terms of the Ukraine stuff because they have relationships with Russia as well. So the issue here is that Israel may weaken US and its allies in order to fight this war as it escalates, and it has escalated now between Iran and Israel. If this were to happen, because remember, Iran and Saudi Arabia are enemies in terms of oil production and ideology. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. Iran is a revolution. if Russia supports Iran in having a nuke, then Saudi Arabia would likely want one too. And that may be a good thing or a bad thing, because it turns out that having nukes is the only way that you can stop these expansive, but Israel doesn't want that, because Israel wants to be the only one that has the nuke. And so this is getting very, very dangerous, and a situation that I believe hopefully this weekend has led to de-escalation. Okay, so you understand that relationship between Russia and Iran. You understand that Russia sees Ukraine as an expansive towards NATO, and then a destabilization. And any type of escalation right now, because Russia and Ukraine is one thing to the US, but US having to be involved in nuclear armed Israel and potentially nuclear armed Iran through the support of Russia is a conflict that would be significantly more important, and that would likely lead to Saudi Arabia wanting to develop their own nuke as well. And so that is the situation that we are currently in right now, and US would likely have to retaliate, because they've said that they will defend Israel at all costs. So the current focus, think about it, of Congress right now trying to get more and more funding for Ukraine would probably be massively decreased, because Israel would essentially take priority if it ever were to escalate to that situation. Okay, I think that's going to do it for now. I did have more content. I thought I could cover more. It's definitely been over time. So I hope that really helps you understand the situation that we're in right now. Maybe it confused you a bit more, but I'm going to be doing an animation. Make sure you have registered on simondixon.com, and I'm going to put together like a more succinct animation to make sure that we understand this. And as I've always said, geopolitically significant is how these countries transition to their world of central bank digital currencies, and implementing the Bitcoin hedge, that you as an individual, every company, every country, and every central bank will need to determine which side of history they are going to be on. Next week, I'm going to be covering more on the US side and the strength that they have. And then I'm going to be doing a bit more on the China side, and the week after. So let me know in the comments section what you think. And, remember, we are looking for de-escalation is the name of the game at the moment. And we hope we get that, but we shall see in the weeks ahead. So always remember, you are alive at one of the scariest, interesting, and most exciting times in financial history. If you get on the wrong side of this, some are going to be wrecked, others are going to do really well. And I want to make sure that you are on the right side of this change. We want to do it with peace. We want to do it with love. We want to do it with unity. But the proof of weapons network being backed by these military industrial complexes, and these geopolitical corridors are getting in the way of that. But hopefully we move to a bit more of a multipolar world where everybody is not incentivized, and we are incentivized by peace. In the meantime, we'll watch oil, we'll watch the commodities, we'll watch gold, we'll watch Bitcoin, and very shortly we'll be entering into the Bitcoin halving phase, and we enter that new 4-year cycle where I believe the theme of Bitcoin will be its geopolitical significance, as more countries and central banks start to engage with Bitcoin. And hopefully we can avoid World War III, but if not, there'll be a monetary renegotiation at the end of it. And I think that Bitcoin, being the only tool that can replace gold in terms of its auditability and its function to be able to work digital, may be significant. But even if it's not, you can participate. Peace.